Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Angela Saavedra. I'm the director of the Center on the Hill. And thank you so much for joining us today for the speaker series online. Today, I'm very excited to introduce my sister, Elizabeth Sawyer, who is with us. She is a graduate of the College of William and Mary with 15 years of experience working at archaeology sites in Virginia and Massachusetts. She currently works as an archaeological analyst at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and is an active with the Council of Virginia Archaeologists, serving as a secretary and the co-chair of their public education committee. I'm really excited to have her here today. I'm sad to say I've never seen her present before, so I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. I have been to Monticello a few times, and if you haven't, you should too when the world opens back up, because it's quite beautiful and really interesting slice of history. So thank you so much for joining us today, Beth.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to get to do this presentation. This is actually the first one I've been able to give since going on work from home orders. And it's really exciting for me because one of our big programs at Monticello is outreach and education. So thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about archaeology at Monticello, at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and hopefully give you a little taste of our research. All right, so today we're going to start off talking about some basics. We're going to discuss what is archaeology, how do we conduct research, some archaeological methods, and then how do we apply these methods at Monticello? So talk more specifically about sites at the plantation and the plantation community. So talking about areas of homes of enslaved workers, as well as the Jefferson family. So to start off, what is archaeology? It is the study of remains from people and cultures in the past. And this is a really broad definition, but it encompasses every aspect of what we do. We study everything from monumental architecture. Everyone knows about archaeologists who study the pyramids and things, down to little teeny tiny remnants of the past, artifacts. We study plant remains and animal remains. We can reconstruct past environments using pollen analysis and chemical analysis. So really anything that's left behind from people and culture, archaeologists like to dive into or delve into. We always tell our school groups that that means that we study trash. And trash was very different in historic times and prehistoric times. People didn't have these huge landfills. They didn't have these large areas where they were dumping trash. Instead, artifacts, trash, normally ends up right outside someone's home. So archaeologists, when we go out and we search the landscape for sites, what we're looking for are artifact concentrations, and those normally give us a clue that there's a house or a structure nearby. And what we really are trying to get at is learning about the daily lives of people in the past. And archaeologists, we use a lot of lines of evidence to get at a holistic picture, as much as we can, a holistic view of how people were living in a given time period, how that might compare to people in a different time period or a different region. So we try to find the connection between historical documents, oral histories, and artifacts themselves. And you see that here on the right-hand side, we have a document from Thomas Jefferson. It's a list of enslaved workers on his plantation. We have a porcelain plate that was found at Monticello. And then in the center there, this is what we're trying to get at, the people that, that we can connect with in the past. So how do we conduct our research? Well, we always start with historic documents. Thomas Jefferson was a prolific record keeper, and he loved to keep records of his plantation at Monticello, which is located outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. So it was when he settled there in 1770 and made it the center of his farm, it was kind of on the frontier of Virginia. It was kind of on the fringe. It was a good journey to get to Richmond or Williamsburg. Williamsburg was the capital in the 1770s. And so Thomas Jefferson enjoyed being a farmer at this location, but he was also a lawyer. He was educated in surveying. So he was a Renaissance man. He had lots of talents and interests and pursuits. And most of them he tried to engage with at Monticello. So he left behind a lot of records of his plantation. We have farm books, account books, we have memoranda and survey drawings and survey notes, and a lot of information. But the tricky thing with drawings is that they always leave something out, or historic documents, they always leave something out. So when we look at documents, we have to think really critically of what is included on documents. So in this instance, a map, and what is missing. This particular map that you see is an overlay of 2 of Jefferson's surveys from 1806 and 1809. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see where he has, and I'm just going to gesture with my mouse here. You can see where he's drawn his mansion, Monticello Mansion. This is the second iteration. I'll talk about that later, but this is what it would have looked like in 1809. And then he's drawn several outbuildings on this road. It was called Mulberry Row, where there were workshops and homes for enslaved workers. He has roads drawn leading out on his plantation. He had a series of roundabouts. So we have the first roundabout, the second roundabout, the third one, I've zoomed in too much, you can't see. And then here's the fourth one. And these were circular ring roads around the mountain, which is a clever way when you're living on a mountaintop to connect people and connect areas, to make circular roads. And then there were connecting roads like this one, which was the farm road, and went through a lot of the agricultural areas. So he has marked several things for us on this map. There's a lot we can learn from this about how people are moving through the plantation, where outbuildings are organized. On his survey notes, he has measurements between these buildings and distances. That's great, that's exciting for archaeologists. But then there's some things missing. So we know these are outbuildings, but what exactly are they used for? When were they built? They're standing in 1806 or 1809, but how long were they there? Did they only ever serve one purpose? We have this little square far on the right-hand side, this little tiny square, and it's next to, it says Cherry in his handwriting, in Jefferson's handwriting. And we know from his notes that this is an overseer's house. But again, we don't have a name associated with it. Is it overseer and his family? Are there homes for enslaved workers around it, as was a common practice at the time? So you can see where there's a lot to learn from documents, but there's also a lot of gaps that archaeology tries to fill in. Sometimes literally, we're filling in the map here. One of our first steps for locating sites after document research is to do a survey. And at Monticello, we've conducted a survey of the plantation. Jefferson owned about 5,000 acres in his life. Our foundation, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, owns about 2,500, and we've surveyed about half of that. So what we do is we set up a grid across our area, in this case, Monticello Mountain proper. And here's the mansion again in the center. It looks very similar to Jefferson's maps. Some of his drawings have been overlaid in brown here, his road systems, and we've been able to find those roads and map those roads in. So we set up this map, and it's all geo-referenced to the Virginia State Plane Coordinate System, to geo-referencing throughout the country. So we're not operating in a vacuum. All of this information correlates out to the greater world. And each one of these little tiny dots is where we dig a hole in the ground. We put in a shovel test pit on 40-foot intervals, so these big ones. And then when we find an artifact, we get really, really excited, and we put in a closer interval of STPs, shovel test pits, at 20-foot intervals, and we can end up with these concentrations of artifacts. Okay, so again, that process is we map out an area, we dig a hole every 40 feet, we screen for artifacts. When we find artifacts, we dig at a closer interval. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see what those concentrations look like. Now you can see the space between the dots. So these areas where we're at 40-foot intervals means we're not finding any artifacts, and the closer intervals means we are finding artifacts. Okay. And that helps us identify sites. So as I mentioned earlier, refuse is not really moved away from homes in the way that it is today, but rather it collects near sites. So where we have these artifact concentrations, we're able to determine that there's a structure, a home, or several homes in one area. We can also look at the artifacts that we've recovered from each site and get some estimates on dates. We can look at the ceramics, the pottery that's being found, tie that to production date ranges, and get some estimates. So here you see blue are early period sites for Monticello, and red is late. So early is about 1740 to 1790, and late's about 1790 to 1830. And through this process, we found about 40 historic sites on the mountain, as well as some prehistoric sites. This includes home for enslaved workers, overseers' houses, workshops, stables, tobacco barns, all the things that you need on a plantation. And probably 80% of these do not show up in Jefferson's documents. So if we were only using those maps or only using those written records, we'd be missing out on a whole lot of history. So once we identify where to dig, where sites are located, we can start creating some research questions and hone in on a certain area. And if we're out in the woods, if we're digging through plowed layers in the ground, we can use things like shovels, and you see here on the left. We always screen for artifacts. There's a couple of different methods for recovering artifacts, but we start with screens, and then sometimes we'll collect sediment samples if we want to do testing for soil chemistry, if we want to gather pollen grains, or for looking for more environmental remains of the past. We can do something called flotation, where we collect big sandbags of dirt from the site, put it in a big tank, and all of the botanical remains float to the top. So you get little bits of charred seeds and charcoal that float to the surface. And when that's collected and analyzed with our specialists, macrobotanical archaeologists, ethnobotanical archaeologists, and they will analyze those, and they can figure out exactly what people were cooking in their fires, what trees they were using to build their homes or to build their fires. So a lot of really interesting stuff depending on how you collect your information. All right. And depending on where we're located, we also might use small tools. I think when everyone thinks of archaeology, they think of little tools and brushes and things, and we definitely use those too, especially when we're inside buildings. And we'll talk more about this particular site here in a minute. All of the artifacts that are collected are brought to our lab, and that's where I do most of my work now. I've worked in the field and worked on other projects, but what I do now is a lot of artifact processing and analysis. So artifacts are cleaned. On the left here, you can see the cleaning process. It's really simple: water and a toothbrush. Metal artifacts are just cleaned with a dry brush, so they don't that doesn't promote corrosion. But otherwise, it's just simple water. And this particular pile of artifacts is burned glass that's gotten all melted and bubbly. And then on the right, you can see someone working on cataloging. So this is one of my former colleagues, Caitlin, and she's analyzing artifacts and then entering information into our database. So all of these artifacts, once they're cleaned up, we can identify a lot of information about them. We can identify what they're made of, how they were made, where they were made, and when they were made, for the most part, some more than others. So here I have some examples of artifacts from Site 8, one of those homes that was a blue circle on our map, one of the sites identified through plantation survey. And we have things brought in from Europe and other countries, so evidence of the global economy that we're finding on the plantation. So this ceramic came from England. It's from the Wedgwood factory, the Wealden and Wedgwood factory. This is Chinese porcelain. And then down here is a Virginia-made earthenware. Tobacco pipes were brought in from England or Holland. As you see on the right, that's a Dutch example. Wine bottle glass came from England or France. Buttons were imported until the 19th century. And then some things were fashioned by hand on the plantation, such as this bone toothbrush, which would have been carved by hand. These could be purchased as well, but you could just carve them by hand for yourself. And it would have had boar's hair bristles attached into each one of those little holes Doesn't sound very pleasant for brushing teeth, but it got the job done. So, and some of the details that we would record in our database, we would record any type of decoration on an artifact, measurements, again, how it was made, where it came from, and this gives us a lot of clues about how people are acquiring their possessions, how they're using them, and how and maybe why they're throwing them away. We often find broken things, but you can see these buttons, they're in pretty good shape. Sometimes we find lost things that just fall off, or sometimes we find items that aren't popular anymore. They're not fashionable. It's the iPhone 1 and it's getting thrown in the recycle bin because the newest and greatest iPhone is out on the market, and you're going to throw away your old one and get the latest and greatest thing. Okay. I keep talking about our database. This is what it looks like on the front end. So this is something you can explore on your own if you'd like. We use the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery, which is a database that was actually started at Monticello about 20 years ago. And it's the longest running artifact database in the country. And it includes sites from Virginia, where it started, and then it grew out to the greater Atlantic world. So you can see my map there on the right-hand side. We have sites from the Southeast, the Caribbean, and it's continuing to expand. We're hoping to get some sites up from the Deep South here soon. So there's a front access page where you can go in and see all of our research from different sites at Monticello and elsewhere. You can click through object galleries, and you can do as much research as you'd like using this database. It's been great during this work at home time because it's all cloud-based storage. It's all accessible when I input data as well as accessible online. So I've been able to catalog and process artifacts at home and do all the same analysis I would do at work right from the comfort of my home office. All right, so that's how we find sites, how we process artifacts, catalog artifacts. Now we've got to try to put things together, okay? So we're gonna look at some of our evidence from our fieldwork, our excavations. We always kind of circle back to the excavations after we do our artifact analysis. So we can look at site stratigraphy, which is looking at the layering of sediment in the ground. And here I've kind of outlined it. We have very beautiful red clay in this part of Virginia. So it's kind of a gradient of red and orange, but so you might have to take my word for it that these layers are different. But archaeologists look for changes in the sediment as we dig, looking for changes in the sediment or soils to give us clues about different deposits that are being laid down for different reasons. So for example, up top here, this is fill dirt. That's used to level. We're on the west lawn of Monticello in this photo. There's a lot of organic processes. You can see where roots are coming down, and then as you get further down, you're getting into more solid clay. Archaeologists, I should have mentioned this earlier, archaeologists normally dig until you get to undisturbed soils. So way down at the bottom here, this is the bedrock of the mountain is starting to pop up. It's the clay, the natural clay of the mountain. So that's geologic time. We don't go any deeper than that. But this depth can vary a lot. On that shovel test pit survey, you might only dig this deep through a layer of plow zone from farming with maybe a little tiny bit at the bottom of historic period occupation, and then you're in geologic time. But if you're on a floodplain, if you're next to a river and if you're digging a prehistoric site, you might go 15 feet deep before you get to undisturbed sediments. So it can vary greatly depending on what site you're on. So these layers in the ground are really telling us time, archaeological time, right? So the newest is on top, the oldest is on the bottom, and that's very relative, right? But to get to absolute dating, we have to look at the contents of each deposit, the artifacts that are found within them. And if we're fortunate enough to find ceramics in a deposit, most of these, as I mentioned, a lot of them are imported, which is great because that means we have a document that says from the Wedgwood factory, hey, this type of ceramic was made from 1740 to 1770. And then, Chinese porcelain decorations are documented in account books as being, this style from 1810 to 1820. So we put all that in our database. As we're cataloging, we're making all of those notes, and then we can come up with something like this. We could come up with a site chronology. And this is an example from a site available on that DAX website. It's a site from up by the mansion, a home for enslaved workers up by the mansion. And you can see we're telling time on the y-axis here using mean ceramic dates. So we're calculating those dates based on the ceramic composition and when they were manufactured. And then our x-axis is, I always think this is funny, dimension 1, welcome to the first dimension. It's a correspondence analysis as a statistical tool that we use. And so this is a correspondence analysis dimension 1 score. I won't get into all that math. You can send me a question about it if you want to hear more, but it's just part of our stats analysis process. So the takeaway is that we're able to make these chronologies where each little dot is a different deposit on the site, one of those layers in the ground, and it's going to date to a different time period. So in this example, we can see 4 different phases of occupation occurring on this one site. Okay. So that's the overview, that's the process. To get into some more concrete details, I've been kind of talking up here. We're going to turn to one of the homes for enslaved workers. This would have been enslaved field workers located on the plantation. So again, remembering that map that we were looking at where there were lots of blue and red circles, this is one of the red circles. And it's located here off of the 4th roundabout. Again, I was referring to these as ring roads. They're not exactly circular or ovals. They follow the contours of the land, but you get the idea. So this is where Site 6 is located on the Monticello quarter farm. Jefferson employed a system like many other plantation owners where he had so much property he had to kind of divide it up. Otherwise, his workers would be spending all day trying to walk from place to place and get to the fields they needed to be at. So each one of these quarter farms had an overseer and a set of enslaved workers that were designated just to work on those agricultural fields. So we have Monticello, we have Tufton, down here on kind of the bottom right, and then up at the top, Shadwell, where Jefferson was born. That was his father's core of the plantation, and Jefferson moves it after his father's death. And then the Lego farm as well. And then there's some modern contours. So if you notice, like this is Interstate I-64 running through here. Modern contours overlaid on this particular map. So Site 6 is near this little spring-fed stream. It's near a water source. So we find a lot of our sites are near good water sources. Kind of going back to this map. So just again, we're right here in the red period. And I kind of shouted out some dates earlier. You can see them on the side. These colors also refer to different agricultural schemes that Jefferson employed at different times. So the tobacco period of farming is taking place during the blue 1740s to 90s. And then wheat farming is taking place later. And you can see how people are oriented on the landscape very differently. They're kind of clustered and near the top of the mountain in that tobacco farming period. And then they're spreading out, but they're also following roads. They're right next to, you can't really see the contour map underlay here, but they're like near ravines and things. And that's because wheat farming, you've got to plow huge expanses of land. Tobacco, you can throw a tobacco plant between tree stumps. You don't have to clear cut everything. But for wheat farming, you've got to use plows. That also means that you've got to rotate your fields. So you now need a lot more cleared area. You have draft animals and grazing animals that are getting introduced. Jefferson had merino sheep that were grazing on the hillsides and rotating through with wheat agriculture. So we find that people are arranged on the landscape very differently. And in exploring Site 6, we found a ton of artifacts. So again, dating from about the 1790s to 1830s. And this is also giving us clues. We can compare this back to other research done from the tobacco period of farming and look at, what difference that's making in people's lives, not only where they're located on the landscape, but how they're having access to goods during that same time. It's kind of a talk for another day, but give you a hint. So tons of artifacts popped up at Site 6. All elements of daily life, right? So we have everything from the nails that you build your house out of. These would have been log cabins for the most part, but they could have had wood paneling on the inside, doors, cabinets, etc. Musical instruments, we found a couple of jaw harps at the site. If you're not familiar, you can look up a picture. I should have put what it looks like complete, but it's a little harp with a flexible tang that you flick. They still use it in bluegrass music today. So it's always fun when we find such a personal item on a site as a musical instrument. Clothing buttons and ceramics as well. And this is just a sample. We found thousands of artifacts, so I can't get them all on my screen at once. But this is just a sort of example of typical finds from Site 6. And one of the questions we get a lot is, wait a second, you said this was a house for enslaved workers. How are they acquiring so much material? And what we've found at Monticello, other plantations, people doing research for the last about 40 years, is that slaves actually purchased a lot of items. They were given very little through provisions. Again, those Jefferson documents are great with provision lists, but they're getting things like blankets, fabric for clothing, salt pork, cornmeal, maybe a cooking pot, but not enough to conduct your everyday life. So they're purchasing their own ceramics, their own buttons, their own musical instruments. Well, how are they getting money? They were allowed to have their own garden plots. They were allowed to raise chickens. They had very little time to do this. It was only in the evenings or on Sundays. Maybe children or older people could help with this enterprise as well. But those items could be sold back to the plantation owner. We have documents where Jefferson's wife is buying things from enslaved workers. And then it could also be trade or sold at marketplaces on Sundays, where they could barter and they could sell produce to get these goods. So it's a very complicated economic system, even within the enslaved population, right? And so these artifacts also tend to pop up in concentrations, like I was talking about. Trash is not really spread that far from where you're living. So we make these distribution maps. You can see our little survey squares on the right-hand side that correlates with the squares you see excavated in the photograph. And we try to spread our squares out. We employ, again, a statistical method called stratified random sampling, but that just means that you're putting in kind of like a game of Battleship. You want to spread out where you're getting information from. Look for artifact concentrations, and then you can focus in and dig more in those areas. Since these were log cabins, we haven't found any architectural foundations. We're not finding hearths or cellars or pits. It's to be expected for the time period, but we do have these hot spots. So big areas of, in this case, Chinese porcelain. This correlates with other artifact types, just this one. This map's the most clear. Hot spots are in red, and then low areas of concentration are in blue. These might be where those gardens were located, or a yard space that you're using for chickens. So there's a lot of clues that we can get where even when artifacts aren't there. My boss always says zeros are data too. Even if artifacts aren't there, it can tell us a lot about how people are using the site. All right. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we found. And then, like I said, we always try to link back to people. We have in the Jefferson documents some ideas of who might have lived at Site 6. I've kind of zoomed in on, this is a couple of unrelated men who might have been living at Site 6. There's also families listed. Unless we find something with someone's initials, we can't identify exactly who is living in these cabins. This is a list of people living on the entire quarter farm. So, we can't quite identify it. I should say that the artifact concentrations, because we have these two hot spots, are indicating at least 2 cabins on the site. Should have said that earlier. Okay. And because we know that there are both families and unrelated people, but Jefferson has grouped them together, we might have one house where a family's living there and the other house is unrelated men. We might have a house, the artifacts sometimes are, and in this case, are different between the 2 houses. So we might have one family that maybe is a little better established or has a slightly higher social standing. So they can access things like Chinese porcelain, really expensive goods, a little easier than the other households. So that's something that we're trying to explore more as we continue working at that site. Okay. So to wrap up, I'm going to bring it back to the mountain top, kind of end back at the core, and give you one more little case study in archaeology. This is what Monticello Mountain looks like today. I hope everyone is able to come visit once we get out of this, this strange time that we're in right now. And it took a lot of work to get the mountain back to looking like this, as it would have looked when Jefferson lived here about 1809. And so there was a big mountaintop restoration project starting back in 2011, 2012. We've reconstructed road systems. We've reconstructed areas under the house, homes for enslaved workers. We have some reconstructions on the property. And all of this gave archaeologists an opportunity to go in ahead of those projects and do excavations and inform that restoration process. So one of the really cool sites that we got to work in is the South Pavilion. So back in 1770, Jefferson designed this house, which looks very different from what we have today. This is before going to France and getting inspired by domes and all the fancy things of France. And he had this little building here, the South Pavilion, and this is where he and his wife and children lived while the mansion was being constructed. Not sure why I did that. And this is what it looks like today. This is the little South Pavilion today. The upstairs was living quarters for Jefferson and his family, and the downstairs was a kitchen. And the kitchen may have had 1 or 2 enslaved workers living there as well. We're still trying to piece that out. And this is the Jefferson document that shows us what the basement looked like here, where we have a set of stairs. This would be a fireplace. We'll come back to what the rest of this jazz is in a minute. And then his original plan was to have a colonnade coming out here, and he'd have a bunch of dependency buildings or outbuildings off to the side. We know that this one was constructed. It was called the dry well. I won't get into the excavations for that. Were really cool. I can tell you another time. So they did find this archaeologically in the 1980s, but the rest of this we don't think was constructed. Okay, so when we went in to do excavations, we had to dig through 3 feet of fill because in 1809, when Jefferson reconfigured the house, the enslaved workers had to come in and fill the floor. They had to raise the floor of this building. So the modern day surface is up here, and then the 1770s surface is down here, which is very exciting for archaeologists because it made it like a little time capsule getting enclosed there. So when we dug in, we found the original floor, the original cooking hearth, and a set of stew stoves, which is a French style of stew stoves. And turns out that's what this is that Jefferson drew. And then this big long thing is a dresser, which is like a big countertop built into the wall. And we also found evidence for that, the footings for that. But this was really cool. We didn't know that he had actually, because so many things on this sketch, as I was saying before, parts of it we knew, like this was built, but not really the rest of it. We didn't know that this was sitting underneath there for all of these years. All right, and so here's another look at this, this stew stove. This was like high-tech technology for, this probably went in the 1780s. And what it did was it allowed you to control the heat of what you were cooking, which sounds really simple, but if you're used to cooking on an open hearth, you might have your bread oven on the side, but everything else is in one big fire. You can't control the heat that much. But if you're trying to make things in the French style of cooking, where you need to have sauces bubbling at one temperature and fish cooking at another temperature, you need to have something like this. So it's set up like a modern day stove. It's just in a line instead of in a square. So at the base here are the little cleanouts. You see the ash from the last fires of 1808 before this building was converted to a wash house and the floor was raised up. You can see the attachments for the upper portion, and then on the right is a reconstruction. So again, sort of the cleanouts underneath. You could put hot coals in the grates, and then your pots would sit on top. And you could adjust the temperatures that way by controlling the heat of those of the coals and of the fires and things. So this was really, really exciting for us. We also found some really cool artifacts, including the base of a mortar and pestle for grinding spices or medicines. And we, again, unless someone's initials on it, we can't say that this is the exact same, but on a list of kitchen furniture, so kitchen items, from 1796, James Hemings, the brother to Sally Hemings, he was one of the enslaved chefs at Monticello. He wrote out this list. This is his handwriting. And he includes 1 brass pestle and mortar and 1 marble of ditto. And we think this might be the brass. It is definitely a brass mortar base. We think it might be James Hemings's brass mortar base. So it's always really exciting when you can get something that connects you to the people working or living in a certain place. And then other artifacts that we found, again, pertain to a lot of cooking, butchered animal bone. We found tons and tons of ceramics. And then, as I sort of mentioned, in 1809, when Jefferson kind of reconfigures everything, this room is then used as a wash house. And we found a lot of sewing and clothing items, because laundering also includes a lot of mending and ironing and other things where you'd have pins and fasteners kind of popping off of clothing. All right, so this was a really interesting project to kind of get us thinking about the Monticello household again, and how it was operating with enslaved workers, and how it changed through time. Archaeology, it's always really interesting to see how dynamic history is and fluid, right? How things are always kind of changing through time. And again, this is what we're trying to do with archaeology: look at different lines of evidence, connect documents, artifacts, people, and learn about daily life in the past. So thank you all very much for having me today. And I hope you all send me some questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate that. That was a really fantastic presentation. I learned a lot, and I have some questions for you. So my first question is, kind of timeline-wise, how long start to finish from where you pick a site and do your little hole tests to when it then becomes kind of that grid of excavation where you're actually pulling real artifacts out and doing things? What's like kind of a typical timeline?
Yeah, that's a good question. So archaeology is definitely a career of patience. From survey to now, we have spent 10 field seasons at Site 6. So that's only in the summers, and working with our field schools. I should have mentioned, we bring out students in conjunction with UVA to learn archaeology, and they do excavations with us. So it's not quite as fast going because it's also a class. But we've had 10 summers of field work at Site 6, and we've excavated about 130, I think it's 130 or 135 of those little 5 foot by 5 foot squares. So we've gotten a good number done, but we're not working year round. So if we were working there year round, we probably would have been done in a year or two, getting sort of as much as we want from the site. We never excavate a site completely because we want to leave something there for future archaeologists to explore who might have different methods and research questions too. So.
That's great. Okay, and so to that point a little bit is, what was maybe the most unusual or unique thing that's been found that you can share with us at Monticello?
Sure. I think architecturally, finding those stew stoves was a pretty big surprise. Again, anytime you find something that matches a sketch, something that we thought, oh, did Jefferson just doodle this one night? This is just his idea. Did it actually come to pass? So finding evidence of that is always really exciting. Artifact-wise, I have a few favorite artifacts. I'm trying to think. The mortar base was definitely very cool. Again, being able to possibly connect it to James Hemings. The tobacco pipe that was in one of those pictures. If I was faster tech-wise, I'd be able to pop these pictures back up. But the tobacco pipe that came from Holland, that was pretty cool. It had a maker's mark on it, and it came from Holland. We've had a couple of really cool buttons over the years, like highly decorated, silver plated or highly ornate, where you think, oh, someone was really mad when this fell off, and they lost it. And then it's also fun to see artifacts of visitors. So the Monticello is currently owned by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation since 1923. So for the last 100 years, we've had people visiting the mountain and leaving their own trash behind. So there was one excavation we were working on where we found like a Moroccan coin from the 1940s. We find 1980s flashbulbs, not as interesting, but it's kind of fun just to see even more recent finds when they're diverse like that.
Cool. And then what are, I guess, you kind of sort of answer that. What are your favorite things to find? Like, what do you particularly enjoy cataloging and finding? Because you said you do most of your work in the lab now. So what are your favorite things?
I definitely enjoy tobacco pipes. There's a lot that we can learn, from very small pieces of things. So good examples of that are ceramics, where I was talking about you can identify a decorated pattern, you can learn where it came from, when it came from. People have done studies on how much things cost, so you can kind of analyze, okay, people at this site are choosing to spend their money on ceramics. We're finding a lot of highly decorated, fancy ceramics. People on this other site are choosing to put their money into buttons. We're finding snazzy buttons. And then tobacco pipes are one of those things that are normally imported. You could have had corncob pipes and other things, but when you find the white clay tobacco pipes, they're in varying levels of expense. But they also cut through every socioeconomic class. Everyone was addicted to tobacco in the 18th and 19th century. So I think they're cool on a lot of levels. You can look at them as just objects and evidence of people choosing to spend their money. They're a very personal item. It's something people are carrying it around in their mouth or in their pocket. The decorations can sometimes be really elaborate. We have one in the office that has it's an animal, but it looks very human. So we call it the pig bear man, because we can't tell if it's a pig or a bear or a man. That Dutch pipe with the maker's marks, so I was able to trace that, getting to do a lot of hands-on research, contacting a pipe museum in Holland and talking with the curator there, identify when that pipe was made in the 1770s to 1790s. Schoenhoven, Holland. It's just cool to get to engage with history on that level. So that's my very long answer, but I really enjoy working with artifacts that are very personal, that can give us some real clues to why people had them, or maybe why they were choosing to have them, and what they were enjoying out of it too.
Great. So my last question then is, how long have people, I think I heard you mention this in an answer to another question, but how long have people not been sort of residing at Monticello? So when did it stop becoming a residence and turned into sort of the foundation and the historic site that it is now?
That's a good question. I'm sorry, I should have covered that right at the beginning. So Thomas Jefferson constructed the house starting, he ordered it for construction to start in 1770. Then it was in use by him until his death in 1826. There were periods where he wasn't there. So when he was Minister to France, when he was President of the United States, but there were always people living there. His extended family moved in. I would encourage you to visit our Monticello.org. You can learn more about Thomas Jefferson and his family there, but he had 2 daughters that survived to adulthood from his wife, and then 6 children by Sally Hemings. And so there were, and then his daughters each had, one of them had 12 children. So they each had children. And a lot of them were living there on the property with him. So after his wife passed away, his oldest daughter became the matriarch of the family and was sort of the first lady in DC. And she was also the first lady of Monticello, where her family is living there. So the house itself had, at one point in his retirement, I think there were 26 people living in the house. So his children, their husband, his daughter, her husband, their 12 kids, their kids, like they were just, he had an aunt that was living there. So it was a very, very busy place. Then Jefferson dies in 1826, and the home is put up at auction. He dies a pauper, basically. He kept this is a little bit of trivia I like to say, he kept really detailed account books of what he was spending. He never really totaled them, though. We don't have any, like, him doing a balance at the end of the year. The checkbook is never really balanced. So he writes down what he's spending and what he's taking in, but he never checks to make sure that those match. So he dies horribly in debt. The family they take most of the, nice things out of the house or possessions, but they sell most of the slaves. Many of them go to non-family members. There's an auction on the west lawn of Monticello. And the property itself is sold. It passes between one or two owners before landing in the hands of Uriah Levy in the 1830s. I believe it's 1836. I'd have to double check. And he's a Commodore in the U.S. Navy, Admiral. Later on, they switch between Commodores and Admirals. Anyway. And he was a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson's. He was Jewish and was a big proponent of religious freedoms, and really adored Jefferson for his Statute of Religious Freedom writings and so forth. So he was a bigwig in the U.S. Navy. There's a synagogue named after him at the Naval Academy or Temple. My apologies that I don't remember which one. Named after him at the United States Naval Academy. Anyway, so he owns the property until the Civil War. And then since he's a Yankee, he's from New York, his property is seized. There's like a huge legal battle. He passes away and his son owns the property, his nephew then owns the property until 1923, and the foundation purchases it. So.
Wow. So yeah, so it didn't have that many hands, really. I just kind of thought that it went through like a lot of hands before, eventually getting sort of marked as historic, but that's kind of great. So the things you're finding there really are from the time that the mountain was an active plantation and that people were living.
Exactly. And we can really, there's a stark contrast. The occupation of Jefferson and his family and enslaved workers and white workmen and all the people associated with TJ. He dies at a time where ceramics are changing to this thing called whiteware being really popular. So it kind of is a happy coincidence for archaeologists that after 1830, ceramics really change and like decorations and styles change. So we can really clearly say this is definitely TJ period. This is definitely Levy family. And the Levies own that property then for 90 years. So between the different family members. And so there's a lot to be told about their family as well. It's not their primary residence, but there's still a lot of people living there. They have tenant farmers, and there's slaves there in the 19th century, and then tenant farmers. So yeah, there's a whole nother section of the plantation I didn't talk about today, which is really cool. And then yeah, the foundation has had it since 1923. It's a nonprofit, and we focus on preservation and education.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We really appreciate you speaking with us about this. This is very cool. For more information, everybody can go to the website. You said monticello.org. Yep. And do some research and see some interesting things. Thank you again for being with us. It was great to have you.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care.